Well, hey there, Marie Greene from Olive Knits here, and for today's Knitting Rescue 911, we are talking about swatching and whether you should be swatching flat or in the round. Now, there are a couple of reasons that we swatch before we start a project, especially for a sweater. And the reason is because knitting is all about math. We're creating fabric, and the number of stitches we have in any defined space is going to dictate the size of our sweater, especially. Well, it's going to dictate the size of anything we knit, but that's especially important when it comes to garments like sweaters. Now, when you're swatching, you might run into issues with maybe the yarn that you're using isn't quite heavy enough, or it's not light enough, or you're going to learn a lot about the fabric you're creating and whether or not you're getting the right number of stitches in the space that you're supposed to measure. Now, all of that aside, knowing how many stitches you have is going to be only useful to you if your swatch is really a good reflection of what your knitting is going to be when you're actually working on the project. So if you're going to be knitting something in the round, you'll want to swatch in the round. And if you're knitting something flat, like a cardigan, then you're going to want to swatch flat. A flat swatch is going to tell you what your gauge will be like when you're knitting right side rows as well as wrong side rows. When you're knitting in the round only, you're not having any wrong side rows. So knitting your swatch in the round will give you a more accurate representation of your gauge because it's going to tell you what your gauge is, how many stitches you have in 4 inches or 10 centimeters or whatever the pattern asks you to measure. That's going to give you better information if you're swatching in the same way you're going to be knitting the project. Now, keep in mind too, you should also be swatching with the same needles. That means the same needle size and type that you will be using for your project, and in the same manner. And if the pattern calls for a specific stitch pattern, make sure you're using that as well. Now, not everybody has different gauge when they're knitting flat versus when they're knitting round. So your gauge may be the same. And for me, I'm a big cheater and I always swatch flat because my gauge is really consistent either way. But not everyone's is consistent, so you're going to want to make sure that you are swatching correctly for the project. One thing that happens sometimes when we're swatching flat, and I'll show you on this, I don't know if you can see these little spaces between rows that look a little bit wider than the others. That's called rowing out. And that happens when some of our rows, like either the right side rows or the wrong side rows, are a little bit different tension than the others. We have a tendency to use a little bit more yarn on the purl side rows. Now, everybody's knitting style is different, and the way you knit will have a lot to do with this. But if you are rowing out, for example, and you can kind of see on the front, I don't know if you can see it in the video, but it almost makes some of the rows look embossed, where some of the stitches stand up just a little bit higher. If you see that on your knitting, or you can see some really defined ridges that look like they're happening every second set of rows, that's a sign that you have some inconsistencies in your tension between the right side and the wrong side. That's worth knowing because that's going to affect your gauge. So that's one of the reasons it's really important that if you're going to knit flat, swatch flat. And if you're going to knit in the round, swatch in the round, unless you are a stubborn little cheater like me and you want to do it just one way, that's okay, but always accept the consequences for your actions. So if you decide you're only going to swatch one way and your gauge turns out a little different or funky, that's what we get for breaking the rules. So hopefully that answers your questions about why we swatch flat or in the round, and you'll be able to get the right information from your swatch next time and knit a sweater that fits you just the way you expect it to. If you love to learn new knitting tips and tricks, make sure to like and subscribe here on YouTube so you'll be the first to know when new videos are available.